me, a museum is basically an institution or a place which contains a collection. The type of the museum depends on the type of its collection. It can be a science museum, it can be an art museum, it can be a multi-purpose museum, it can be a site museum on some archaeological sites, it can be a museum exclusively for the children, or it can also highlight the life of a, an important person like Tagore or Gandhi or Shakespeare and others. The type of the museum is also guided by another factor, that who is sponsoring it and how it's being funded. Normally, especially in countries like ours, the museums are funded by the government. So in a sense, they are public museums. And the funding agencies depend on local, that is municipal, or it can be state government, it can be a university, it can be in the most important cases by the federal government, like the Indian Museum Kolkata, the National Museum Delhi, the Salarjung Museum, the Victoria Memorial, etc. But basically, most of our museums are sponsored by states and local agencies or maintained by the different scientific surveys, like the archaeological survey. In addition to that, there are museums exclusively devoted to the ethnography, technological, medical, philatelic like stamps, railway, etc. So you can easily find out the importance of the museum depends on the type of collection it contains. Now the question is how a museum is being formed. The most important part, most visible part of the museum is the museum space, the museum building. And what and where the collection that is on view for the public. But one should not forget that that occupies only about 20, 25 or at the most 50% of the entire activity of a museum. The rest of the activities are not seen by the public. They are behind the scene. That is how a museum is being administered, how a collection is being stored, being identified, being conserved, and also it's being studied. Then comes the question of display. An average visitor can see only the ones that are put on display or put on exhibitions that are held from time to time. These are special exhibitions. I'll come to the point of festivals of India and other exhibitions in our country, and in most of the European and museums abroad, there are big exhibitions based on some important artist or some important event or some important phase of history or some scientific or cultural uh, development. I mean, to me, in my long museum life, one of the most popular exhibitions that I have seen was devoted to fashion. While in the working at the Metropolitan Museum, New York, we saw an exhibition entirely devoted to fashion that perhaps uh, attracted the maximum number of visitors in that big institution.
To me, museums are that chance to, experience human creativity and just be dazzled by the endless imagination and inspiration of our fellow humans here. I have absolutely no artistic talent, but going to museums, looking at objects, brings me close to people who do, and I can only admire what they're able to accomplish.
Museum means to me a place of learning, socializing, motivation, interest, and innovation. And it provides you experience and which otherwise you can't get elsewhere. Museum represents the best human civilization has to offer in terms of creativity and innovation, both tangible and intangible.
To me, a museum is a repository of memory, a repository of memories that are not personal, but memories that belong to the past. And this can be way back in the past, that things as we see around us, those are nobody's memories, but the object reminds us of something that had happened in the past or the way life was in the past. To me, museums represent not only that past memory, it represents something else. So, for example, when I look at the Bharut Stupa, which belongs to the Sunga period, 2nd to 1st century BCE, I think, it holds that memory of what Buddhism was like at that point. There were, it was an iconic Buddhism. There was no icon of the Buddha. But, we see people going about their lives, their worshipping, their stories from the Jataka, and you begin to see how all of that was really part of, everyday life. So it represents that, but it represents something else as well. Because it also represents an object that was brought into the Indian Museum in Calcutta, into the Asiatic Museum, and reassembled there by Sir Alexander Cunningham, who headed the Archaeological Survey of India. And it represents also, therefore, the colonial powers wanting to, display India's past and also being quite competitive. In the sense, Cunningham was very clear he did not want this to go to the British Museum. So, to me, the museum represents both, the object and its period, but also what the collector was trying to do by putting this object in the museum.